Masechet Sotah, Daf Tet Vav. The Mishnah detailed the procedure for the Korban Mincha that the Sotah brings. And then the Gemara quoted a Tosefta that details the procedure of Mincha offerings in general. And so we're going to compare the two to see how is the Mincha of a Sotah different from most other Korban Mincha offerings. And so we're going piece by piece through that Tosefta and also looking at sources for each part of it. So the Baraita mentioned Ma'aleo Maktiro Bichle Sharet. Regarding general Mincha offerings, one takes it and brings it up in a kli sharet and burns it. From the literal reading of this, it sounds like one would burn the mincha offering on the mizbeach inside the vessel, inside the kli sharet. You bring the whole thing up and put the whole thing on the fire, which is not true. Bikli sharet maktir does that mean literally that you would burn it? Maktir means literally to turn it into smoke, to put it onto the fire. Do you do that within the kli? No. Ela ema ma'aleo bikli sharet lehaktiro. Rather, you have to understand the Braita is saying that you bring it up to the mizbeach within a vessel in order to burn it. But then when you actually burn it, you're going to empty out the contents directly onto the fire. And before you burn it, you have to put salt on it, as we mentioned yesterday, salt as a preservative to remember Berit Melach. And then you put it on the fire. Pasuk says explicitly, you have to put every korban mincha offering, you have to put salt on it. Kareb hakometz she'areh nechalin min delan dichtiv iktir hakohen et azkarata vegomer uchtiv vanotem min hamincha laharon ulbanav. Once the fistful, was really 3 fingers, and we'll call it fistful, was taken and put into a separate vessel, and then that was poured onto the fire. As soon as the fistful is burnt, then that permits the leftovers, everything else that's in the bowl, to be eaten by the kohen. And how do you know that? Because these two pisukim are back to back. Once you take the azkarata, the memorial part, that's talking about the kometz, and you burn it, then the rest of it, the Maharon and his sons, meaning the Kohanim, can eat it. Kareva kometz lemor keditle or lemor keditle. Ditmar kometz me matai matir shiraim b'achila. Rabbi Chanina be'amar mishe tishlot bo ha'ur. Rabbi Yochanan amar mishe tisat ha'ur berubo. So when it says kareva kometz, that the handful is burnt, exactly how much of it needs to be burnt, there's 2 opinions. So regarding the kometz, when can they eat the leftovers? Rabbi Chanina says once the fire takes hold of it a little bit, right? Once it ignites and you see that, okay, now it's, just a matter of time that the rest will be burnt. So it just has to be the fire takes hold, meaning the very beginning of the burning. As soon as the Kohen is watching and he gives a signal, okay, everybody, hey, you can eat right now. But Rabbi Yochanan says you have to wait a minute or 2 longer. It's a very small amount, so it wouldn't take very long. But rather, it's when the fire consumes most of the handful. It has to be really almost all on fire, the majority on fire, and only then can the Kohanim eat the rest of it. ודשין הכל ניתן לתוכו יין ושמן ודבש. מה טעמה? אמר קרא למושכה לגדולה כדרך שמלכים אוכלים. Although one is not allowed to put honey on the mizbeach, either because it's a leavening agent and you can't have hametz, and so adding sugar that helps the leaven, or because this is something that idolaters used to do. That's mentioned in Rambam Moreh Nevuchim. Or because this is it looks like maybe the reason idolaters did it is because they're kind of like trying to sweet talk their gods. They think that their gods actually eat it. They eat something sweet, and then they'll be bribed into doing whatever the worshiper is asking for. And so we don't think of korbanot that way. God doesn't eat it. He doesn't eat sweet things, right? This is really an offering of oneself, showing one's own humility, and therefore one should not have something that is like haughty, like hametz or devash on the mizbeach. Okay, so even though the kometz that goes on the mizbeach, you cannot put any honey on it. However, the kohanim, when they're eating the leftovers, they are permitted to mix it with wine or oil or honey. Why? Because the pasuk says that have given you these terumot to the Kohanim. They get all kinds of gifts. Lemoshcha. Moshcha is like from the word Mashiach, meaning anointed with oil. It shows that they're special. Now, who else is anointed with oil? Kings are anointed with oil. So this should be eaten like a king would eat. A king doesn't eat plain crackers. King would eat something with sweet, with oil, with wine. And so to the Kohanim, they are important, they're like kings, and these gifts that they eat, they are allowed to eat them in a luxurious way. And so that's why it's different. The laws of what you put on the Mizbeach are different from the laws of what the leftovers that the Kohanim eat. ואין אסורין אלא מלחמץ תכתיב ולא תאפה חמץ חלקם. אמר רבי שמעון בן לקיש אפילו חלקם לא תאפה חמץ. However, there is one law that is the same. On the Mizbeach, you can't have any chametz, and also the leftovers, which is going to be flour, the Kohanim cannot cook it or let it become hametz. That's the same. Both on the altar and what the Kohanim eat cannot become hametz. How do you know that? Now, it's from this pasuk. Truth is that you could look at the pashat of the pasuk in its context. It's talking about the leftovers that the Kohanim eat, and it says lo te'afeh hametz, period. So all you need is that. But Rish Lakish is making an added darasha on it by taking the word chelkam natati. That's actually part of the next phrase. I gave them their portion. He's moving the comma over to read it lo te'afeh hametz chelkam. The portion that the Kohanim get should not be baked as hametz. Right, even their portion should not be baked as chametz. Okay, even without moving the comma, the pasuk actually does still mean that, but by moving the comma, it even emphasizes it more. We now finished the analysis of that Tosefta, and now we're going to go back to the Mishnah and quote and analyze the rest of it. So the Mishnah says, Kol menachot, it contrasts other menachot with Sotah. The first contrast is that other menachot require oil and frankincense, and the Korban Sotah, the mincha v'sotah does not, because it's a degrading sacrifice, so it shouldn't be made fancy by bringing oil and frankincense. So we ask, v'chol menachot tunot shemen ulbona v'haika minchat choteh derachamana amar lo yasim aleha shemen ve'lo yiten aleha lebona. Is this true that other korbanot, all korbanot require oil and levona? Wait, we have minchat choteh. Minchat choteh is also known as minchat ole veyored. This is specified in Vayikra, chapter 5. It comes for 3 sins. One of them, for example, is if someone makes a vow that they don't have testimony. They withhold testimony under oath, even though they actually do know something about it. So if the person is called Olev Yored, because if the person is rich and can afford it, they bring an animal. Otherwise, they bring a bird, and if they're poor, then they bring just flour. So this is a Korban Mincha for a Hoteh. And the Torah there says he should not bring no oil, no frankincense for that, because it's a sin offering. And so a person should be embarrassed that they sinned and bring something plain to show their humility and embarrassment and not make it fancy. So how come you said all other menachot have oil and frankincense except Sotah, when you have here yet another exception? And the answer is Hachikamar. The answer is that the Mishnah meant to say that all other menachot have at least some of the following properties that they require. Either they require oil and levona, or that they come from wheat, and they has to be finely ground wheat, right? And Sotah has none of those things. Sotah does not have shemen levona, does not come from wheat, rather from barley, and is coarsely ground. Okay, now there are some korban mincha offerings that don't have all of these, but only some. That's true, like minchat choteh, afal pi shena tu'ana shemen levona ba'amin achetin ba'asolet. This minchat choteh, the olev yored, chatat, even though it does not require shemen and levona, but it does come from finely ground flour of wheat. Minchat ha'omer afal pi sheiba min asorin tu'ana shemen levona ba'ageresh. The omer sacrifice on the second day of Pesach, that comes from barley, because it has to. That's the barley, that's celebrating the barley season. So even though it comes from barley, but it's finely ground barley, and it does have shemen and levona. So you see, even though there are exceptions to the rule that not every korban has all of these qualities, most of them do, and even the exceptions are only have an exception for one or two of these qualities, but will have the others. Sotah is the only one that has none of these qualities. Vezo ena te'ona lo shemen velo levona uba min haseorin uba'a kemach. Good. So now we explained that contrast, why Sotah is the least dignified of all the korbanot. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Bedinu shetehem minchat chote teuna shemen ulbona, ושלא יהיה חוטא נזכר, ומפני מה אינה teuna, שלא יהיה קורבנו מהודר. So Rabbi Shimon says, logically, really this minchat chote, the Yored we just mentioned, should require oil and levona, because someone who sinned should not have a benefit, and they have a benefit in that they don't have to pay for the oil and frankincense. Whereas someone brings another type of korban mincha, most other types, they have to pay more than the one who sinned. So logically, it makes sense that we should make the sinner pay more. But nevertheless, we say no, he doesn't have to bring them because their korban should not be mehudar, superior quality, but rather they should recognize their sin by giving something that is lowly and humble. ובדינו שתהיה חטאת חלב טעונה נסכים, שלא יהיה חוטא נזכר, מפני מה אינה טעונה, שלא יהיה קורבנו מהודר. And a similar example regarding the hatat of chaleb. This is the regular korban hatat that one brings for many things. Among them, one of the prime examples is eating chaleb. One eats chaleb by mistake. This is the forbidden fat of an animal. This is the prototypical example of what you'd have to bring korban hatat, or if you do it by mistake, karet, if you do it on purpose. It seems that this was something that was somewhat common because it's very easy for the butcher to make a mistake and put this part of the fat over there. So one could easily violate this without knowing. So this is also another example where a person does not have to bring nesachim. When you bring an animal, this is an animal sacrifice. When you bring an animal sacrifice as a hatat, like if you eat chaleb, you bring the animal only, and you do not bring flour, oil, or wine with it. It's a plain animal. Again, because the person sinned, so they want to show this is not a fancy korban. And the same logic would, you'd think, apply here. Rationally, you'd say, if other types of korbanot, right, if you bring a shelamim and olah, those require nesachim, and you have to pay more. So it makes sense that the sinner should not benefit because he sinned. He should also have to pay more. Nevertheless, despite that logic, another overriding principle takes control, which is that his offering should not be superior quality because this is something that came from a sin. Although he did it unwittingly, but he could have been more careful. So the chatat of a mesorah and his asham, so a mesorah, in order to be purified, he waits 7 days. On his 8th day, he has to bring a chatat and an asham, and he does that. That korban chatat and korban asham does require nesachim because it does not come for it's not because of a sin. Person got mesorah, they got a disease, right? They didn't ask for a disease. What did they do wrong? So because they just got a disease, and this is part of the purification process, they need to bring nesachim, and that's contrasted with the hatat chaleb, which he made a sin and therefore does not have to bring nesachim. Okay, now the Gemara is going to ask about this statement. Ini v'hamar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani amar Rabbi Yochanan al shivat devarim negaim ba'in v'chole. Wait a second. We also learned that skin diseases like mesorah come to a person because of seven sins. The famous one is Lashon Hara, that we get from Miriam, who spoke badly against her brother, and she became a mesorah. But there's others also that are mentioned in Arachin: murder, oath taken in vain, forbidden relations, arrogance, robbery, envy. And so mesorah does come for does come because of sins. Hatam hu deikaparle kimaite korban ishtaruye bekodashim hu dekamaite. Says no, it's different. This is a good insight. that in those cases, let's say someone said lashon hara and they get sarat. So the sarat is the punishment for the lashon hara. So then, once the sarat clears up, that's it. They were atoned already for their sin. The korban hatat that the mesorah brings is simply a purification ritual for the sarat. That hatat is not itself the atonement. Unlike the chatat for cheleb, where a person sinned unwittingly, the korban chatat is the atonement, and so that's why it makes sense for that the korban chatat does not bring the sachim, whereas the chatat of a mesorah, he already was atoned, right? The nega, who itself was the atonement. When he brings the korban, that is simply to permit him to eat sacrificial food so that he completes his purification process. Okay, now we'll keep following this logic. A nazir also has to bring a korban. He has to bring 3 korbanot. One of them is a hatat. So that should require a nesech because it doesn't come from a sin, right? A nazir, doesn't he do something positive? Isn't it good to be a nazir? Yeah, he has to bring a korban chatat, but it should be that he has to bring libations. And the answer is Savadla Rabbi Elazar HaKapar Damar Nazir Name Hotehu. We follow the opinion of Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. We saw quoted a number of times in Masechet Nazir that every nazir is in fact a hoteh. He denies himself something that Hashem said is permitted. Hashem said you could drink wine in moderation, and he goes and above and beyond, and he removes himself and adds more prohibitions to that which the Torah said. That itself is hoteh, and therefore every nazir has to bring a korban chatat, and that's why a nazir does not bring nesachim. That explains it. It is, in fact, there has an element of sin. Rabban Shimon Omer Keshem. Rabban Shimon says, explaining why Sotah brings barley, and says just like she did an animalistic act, so too she brings animal food. Barley usually was eaten by animals. Tanya Amar Lahen Rabban Gamliel Chachamim Soferim Hanichu Li Vedreshenna Kemin Chomer. When Rabban Gamliel was challenged about this, he said to the Chachamim, listen, scribes, referring to the sages, right? If you allow me, I will explain it as Chomer. Now, chomer, this word chomer here is a lot of explanations of what it's referring to. Some say it's referring to some kind of ornament or a ring in which you put spices. In other words, I'm going to add some spice to the law. In other words, some explanation to the law so that it will taste better, right? It will be understood better. So I'm going to give an allegorical explanation so that the law will make more sense. Okay, that's one possibility. I would like to suggest that Chomer here perhaps is a reference to Homer. And just like when Greeks interpreted Homer, they would interpret it in an allegorical way. So he says, I'm going to use an allegorical type of interpretation in order to explain this law. Okay, there's another place where chamor is certainly a reference to chomer in a different midrash. Okay, anyway, it says I'm going to give an allegorical explanation of this, and that's why he presents, she did an animalistic act, therefore she eats animal food. Now, why did he have to say this, kind of to give this explanation? What was he responding to? To this, Dishmael Rabbi Meir dekamar, hi echilato ma'adane olam lefichach korbana ma'achal behema. Amar lo hatanach ashira. Aniya ma'ika lememar, ela keshem shemase mase korban mase behema, kach korbana ma'achal behema. Rabbi Gamliel was responding to Rabbi Meir, who said she, in the long list of midah keneged midah aspects that we saw in the first perek, one of them is that she fed her lover delicacies from all around the world in order to entice him to come and sin and commit adultery. And therefore, midah keneged midah, now instead of delicacies, she's going to have to eat animal food. So Rabban Gamliel says, okay, I understand that midah keneged midah if she is rich, but rich people are not the only ones who are unfaithful. What if she's poor? She couldn't afford fancy desserts to entice. the adulterer, then in that case, she didn't have anything. She had only poor food. So what are you going to say about that? You're going to say if she's poor, then she doesn't have to eat animal food because she didn't have the delicacies? Rather, I have an explanation that can work for all sotahs, whether they're rich or poor, that every sotah does an animalistic act, and so too, her food should be, her korban mincha should be from animal food, from barley. Okay, next Mishnah. היה מביא פיילה של חרס ונותן לתוכה חצי לוג מים מן הכיור. רבי יהודה אומר רבי עית, כשם שמעת ברכתיו, כך ממעט במים. Okay, assuming we're going on, she didn't confess, and now we're going to make her drink, so we have to prepare the concoction of the water mixed with dust and ink. So first you have to get the water. For you bring an earthenware vessel, piali. Here's what it looked like. It was like a big saucer, but it would be made out of clay. Gemara will say why it has to be made out of clay. And you put in it half a log of mayim from the kiyor, right? The kiyor is the wash basin that is in the Bet HaMikdash. Rabbi Yehuda says they don't need so much water, only a revi'it of water. Rabbi Yehuda happens to be in the next Mishnah that we're going to see soon, in a day or two. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says you write down, you erase and the least amount of text. There's different opinions about how much you write and erase. Rabbi Yehuda says the least amount. So since he has the least amount of ink that needs to be dissolved, so he also has the least amount of water. It makes sense. Now he has to get some dust, but the dust has to be from the sanctuary floor, as it says in the pasuk. So he goes into the sanctuary and he turns right. ופנה לימינו, מקום היה שם אמה על אמה וטבלה של שיש וטבעת הייתה כבועבה. כשהוא מגביה נוטל עפר מתחתיה ונותן כדי שיראה על המים, שנאמר ומן העפר אשר יהיה בקרקע המשכן ייקח הכהן ונתן אל המים. And so when he goes to the right there on the sanctuary floor, it was made out of marble tiles, but there was one tile that was 1 amma square. And this tile had a ring attached to it, and so that you could pick it up, right? It was like a kind of like a manhole cover. You pick it up. There's no hole underneath, but rather this tile is not cemented to the ground like the rest of the tiles. Instead, you can pick it up and you can get the loose dust underneath. So you take some of that loose dust and you put it onto the water so that it can be seen. You have to take enough dust that it can be visible upon the water. Why? Because the pasuk says, from the dust that is at the floor of the Mishkan, the Kohen will take and put it on the water. So that's what we do precisely. Tana, Pialeh Shecheres Chadasha, Dibir Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael is adding another requirement that this vessel made out of clay has to be new. A new one. We make a gezer hashava of the word keli from a mesorah. Regarding mesorah, it says keli, and the law of a mesorah is that he also needs a kli cheres that is a new one. And so, since it says the word keli regarding sotah, so we learn also that the sotah requires a earthenware vessel that is a new one. That's the source of Rabbi Ishmael. Now we ask, את הסיפור האחת אל כלי חרס על מים חיים. מה מים חיים שלא נעשתה בהן מלאכה? אף כלי שלא נעשתה בו מלאכה. Well, now let's go back to Mesorah. It actually doesn't say explicitly there that you need a new keli cheres. It just says that you take one of the birds. Mesorah has 2 birds. One of the birds, he slaughters it and the blood goes into a keli cheres. So it has to be keli cheres on top of fresh water or running water. So how do you know that has to be a new keli cheres? Well, we analogize. Just like mayim chayim means fresh water, that it was not used yet, wasn't used for any melacha, like for washing or whatever. So too, the keli, the vessel, has to be something that is new. It was not yet used for any work. So that's how we know that this says the keli here, and the keli also in Sotah. That's how Rabbi Ishmael knows that, derives that we also need a new earthenware vessel for Sotah. So now we say, hold on. Once you opened up this channel and are learning from Mesorah to Sotah, why don't you say, just like in Mesorah, you need fresh water, from a spring, maybe also for Sotah you need fresh running water from a spring. But we didn't see that requirement yet. And the answer is Rabbi Ishmael hachinameh. Damar Rabbi Yochanan mekiyor. Rabbi Ishmael omer memayan hem. Hachamim omerim mishe'ar memot hen. According to Rabbi Ishmael, in fact, yes, you're right. It would be mayim chayim, because he happens to say that that the water in the washing basin is from a spring. So there you go. Yes, you use spring water, and the washing basin that the Mishnah said you use is in fact from a spring. Hachamim say no. You could use any water for the Sotah, and it does not have to be from a spring. And the Kior waters doesn't have to be from a spring. So therefore, that's just fine. Okay, so they're consistent. Now, Ika lemifrach. Hold on. Rabbi Ishmael, why'd you say that you need a new vessel? You learned it by analogy to Mesorah. But hold on, we can reject that analogy. Male Mesorah sheken ta'on ayes erez ve'ezob ushni tolat. A Mesorah, after all, also requires cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet, right? And that's part of the ritual. And Sotah does not have that. So there are many things that are true for Mesorah, but are not true for a Sotah. So therefore, maybe having a new vessel is a requirement only for Mesorah and not necessarily for Sotah. Amar Rabba, Amar Kera bikli cheres kilisha amarti lecha kevar. And Rabba answers, look at the pasuk regarding Sotah. It says lakachoken maim kedoshim bikli cheres. If this was a new requirement, a separate requirement, you'd expect the law here in Sotah to say lakacha kohen kli cheres. So kohen has to take a kli cheres, and then you say yes, take maim chayim, and then you can put it in. But in fact, it doesn't introduce the kli cheres. It means that this is a kli cheres that you already know about, that you already saw one time. Where? Regarding Mesorah. So kli cheres, the same kind of kli cheres that you can use for Mesorah, which is a new one, that also you have to use for a Sotah. That's Rabba's explanation for the Ishmael. Okay, good. Now, Amar Rava, lo shanu ela shelo nitakemu panav. Okay, now Rava is now explaining the other opinion, not the Ishmael. The opinion that says you just need a regular earthenware vessel, even if it's used. It doesn't have to be new, that's just fine. Rava makes a limitation, however. That's only true if it was not blackened from usage. But if this earthenware vessel was used so much that it turned black, then it's no good. He's also comparing it to water, just like Rabbi Ishmael did. He compared to Maim Chayim, fresh water, never used. So he's saying, no, it's like water. Water has to look like water. It doesn't change in appearance. So too, the vessel has to be as new, right? That's a lot of times say used, but it's like new. You see on Amazon. It has to be like new, but if it's all black, then certainly it's no good. Rava asks, he said the halacha himself. Maybe one of these is Rava. Okay, anyway, the question is, if you have a vessel, earthenware vessel that turned black, but then you put it back in the furnace and it turns white again. It burnt out all the impurities, and now it's white again. Is that okay? Do you say that since it was disqualified, now it's disqualified forever, you can't fix it? Or now that it's not black anymore, now it's okay? So we'll try to give an answer. It's won't be successful though. Tashema Rabbi Elazar omer es erez ve'ezob ushni tolat shehifshil bahen kupato la'acharav pesulin ve'ata madri umifshiti. Maybe we can learn it by analogy to the Mesorah, who has to bring es erez ve'ezob and the shni tolat. It's true, he has to bring those for his purification. Let's say they're used, they're not new ones. He already used them to tie to his basket so he could put his basket behind him. In other words, he made straps out of the hyssop and the scarlet and the cedar wood. He made a strap for his knapsack out of it. It's no good. So it's no good. Now, why is it no good? Can't you take it off the strap, make it straight again, and you can make it just like new? And yet it's not allowed. So we could see from this baraita that says it's not allowed, even though it goes back to its original form, that the same thing would be for an earthenware vessel. Once it turns black, it's not allowed, even if you put it back in the kiln and turn it white again. So we can learn the answer is no, and we answer not necessarily. Hatam de ikluf iklufe. No, these items, when you attach them and use them for a strap for your knapsack, they also peel and get destroyed in a way that you can never put it all back to its original appearance. That's why it's no good forever, but there's not necessarily a proof from here regarding the question of Rava. Okay, one more point. Nichnas le'echal ufana limino. When you want to go get the dirt, you go in and you turn to the right. Mai ta'amad amar mor kol pinot shata poneh lo yu ela derech yamin. This is true not only because it just happens to be on the right. What if I want to go all the way around on the other way and go left? No, the law is, and that in the Bet HaMikdash, anytime you turn, you should always turn to the right, which is why if you go onto Har HaBayit, even now, you should turn to the right and walk counterclockwise. And so anytime any Kohanim are walking around on Har HaBayit, they should always be going, turning to the right. And that's this is one application of that general rule. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.